Hey everybody, how's it going? Superfiend here, and welcome to the next video in my short series discussing the gap between guest interaction and the wonderful creations we can build in Planet Coaster. Last time I talked about this, I described the problem, which is we can create such wonderful scenery, but we don't have any tools to cause the guests to interact with it. I demonstrated how we can use existing shop and facility pieces as crude workarounds, but at the same time, they're just not adequate for the job. Today I want to start presenting ideas that could help close the gap between our guests and the scenery within our parks. Before I begin, I want to thank everyone that left feedback on the last video. I enjoyed reading and replying to everyone. A couple comments brought up good points as to why guest interaction is so hard to implement, and it really boils down to the guests don't know what all of our scenery is, and Frontier can't program for every possible interaction. But I think as this series progresses, we'll zero in on some ideas that would go a long way to achieving just an approximation of guest interaction with our scenery. There were also a couple comments suggesting a new type of scenery piece that we could place and use to configure or trigger guest animations. And that is where my initial thoughts on solving this problem led me. So let's give this scenery piece a name and call it a guest interaction point. Hopefully by the end of this series, we'll all have a good grasp on what this guest interaction point will be capable of, how we'll use it, and also how it would change the scope of Frontier's work when creating new assets for the game in their updates and DLCs. Now, I'm not going to talk about the guest interaction point today, however. Instead, we're going to take a slight detour and first discuss solving the problem a simple way. Now, this isn't the way I want Frontier to implement guest interactions, but I think it's important to investigate because it may reveal clues to how we would use a guest interaction point from a user interface perspective. Initially, you might think the basis of this solution is counterintuitive, but I hope to convince you by the end of this video that not only is it intuitive and possible, I think it's an integral piece to implementing guest interaction points. So I'm going to ask all of you an odd question. What if we could make specific shops and facilities invisible? Just to be clear, I'm talking specifically about the facilities the guests actually interact with, such as shops, ATMs, small games, vending machines, all of that stuff. What if, after placing such an item, we could toggle its visibility? Would invisible pieces solve any aspect of the guest interaction problem? Are invisible pieces a hindrance to us as players? In other words, what new problems are created, and are they either manageable or easy to solve themselves? Are they difficult for Frontier to implement? And how would this change Frontier's workflow or deliverables when creating new content or scenery packs? Let us first examine if invisible scenery solves any aspect of the guest interaction problem. As players, absolutely it does. I've already shown how the existing scenery pokes through almost anything we try and build, and having the option to make it invisible would solve that issue completely. Our creativity would no longer be limited by how well we can hide, bury, or mask the assets created by Frontier. It also removes constraints that Frontier may be faced with internally when creating new assets. I'm sure by now Frontier has noticed that we love to take anything and everything they make and turn it on its head for our own uses. With that in mind, artists and asset creators within Frontier may not want to make their creations too big or too gaudy for fear of preventing us from doing that. For example, pretend you are the artist at Frontier responsible for making an ice cream cart. Should it have wheels? Should it have a cover? Should it have a display of ice cream bars? And what about push handles? Those are all things we expect to see on an ice cream cart. But for every visual aspect you add to the cart, you knowingly make it more difficult for players to use it as anything but an ice cream cart. But if you know the players can make the cart invisible, then you're freed from all these potential limitations. You can make the ice cream cart however you like, and the players are free to make it invisible and decorate it differently. Whichever way it's used, the guests will interact with it, and everybody wins. So do invisible pieces solve any aspect of the guest interaction problem? Absolutely. So then we must ask if they introduce any new problems, and I think it's pretty clear that they do. Primarily, after placing a scenery piece and making it invisible, how would we go about editing it in the future? I would solve this problem with the following rule. invisible scenery pieces become visible again whenever the player edits or moves the building or scenery group that the piece belongs to. That works for physically placing or altering the pieces that are invisible, but what if it's a shop or a game and we want to change prices or other configuration? Amazingly enough, these screens are already available to us either through the building dialog or the other game menus, and I don't think any additional work is needed for them to be accessible to us as players if the pieces themselves are invisible. So now let us ask, is this difficult for Frontier to implement? Now, it should not be difficult for Frontier to add a checkbox to their user interface, and it should also not be incredibly difficult to stop selected pieces from being rendered as part of the scene. Now, depending on how shops and vendors are implemented, it could be a special case of programming where making the shop invisible also makes the vendor invisible, and that's not what we want. If we make a shop invisible, we'd still want to see the vendor inside serving guests. Otherwise, open-air facilities would appear unstaffed. Now, as I said in the first video, Frontier knows their game engine a lot better than I do. But I'm pretty confident there's a lot more going on in their engine that's more complex than making a few pieces of scenery invisible. So I do think this solution represents a reasonable scope of work that they could investigate. And if that's all they're capable of implementing for solving this guest interaction problem, then I would begrudgingly take it because it's still better than what we have today. The last bit I want to discuss is how this change would affect Frontier when designing further packs and updates. Well, up until now, every new shop or facility has all the little knobs and bits baked on. What I mean is all the cash registers, drink fountains, milkshake machines, stacked drink cups, popcorn displays, canopies, basically all the small props for a shop or a game or a popcorn cart are packaged as part of that scenery piece, almost like it's a pre-built model kit. Well, Frontier would need to break those apart and supply all of those smaller props to us so that we could assemble those kits however we want according to our vision. And in future updates, if Frontier wanted to add the so-called ice cream cart that we mentioned earlier, then all the interesting bits on it need to become separate scenery pieces instead of one packaged unit. Now, unfortunately, the more such pieces Frontier adds to the game, the more the in-game menus become resource intensive and difficult to navigate. Personally, though, this is a price I'd be willing to pay to have more control over guest interaction with my scenery. Now, I already mentioned the better solution is some sort of new item called a guest interaction point. So why did I spend all this time talking about invisible shops and games when that's not what I really want? Quite simply, the guest interaction point, the solution that I do want, needs to be invisible. We as players need to be able to place it anywhere we want that is accessible to guests without having to worry about hiding it or burying it within our scenery. We also have to feel confident that even though it's not visible, we'll still be able to select it and edit it after it's initially placed. We as players and Frontier as developers need to recognize that separating function from visual representation means that we need more small props to assemble in order to create the scenery that we want rather than a pre-completed kit. Except when we assemble it, we're going to do it according to our own vision. And Frontier's no longer stuck with this impossible burden of guessing every permutation of a piece of scenery. Now, we're going to wrap this one up here before it gets too long. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on implementing the guest interaction point as an invisible piece of scenery. I'd also like to hear any suggestions you have on what kinds of settings we should be able to configure on the interaction point, as that's what I'll be covering in the next video. As always, you can let me know if you're enjoying this series with comments or thumbs up, and that's going to be it for me today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, you have a good afternoon, and take care.